an SS officer who helped run the day-to-day operations of Auschwitz, where about 1.1 million people were murdered between 1940 and 1945.
A dusty photo. A woman who doesn't exist in any record. Girls who vanished without a trace. What started as a routine day in a Berlin museum turned into a terrifying discovery. An erased Nazi facility, a missing war criminal, and a mass grave hidden for 80 years. But the most shocking part? She wasn't forgotten by accident. She was protected by powerful governments. This is the story of a photo that wasn't supposed to survive, and the chilling truth it uncovered. What else has been buried, and who's still keeping it quiet? Join us. Section 1. The photo that shouldn't exist. It was just one photo, yellowing, creased, and tucked inside a mislabeled envelope. But it was all wrong. The girls in the image were too still, too perfectly arranged. Their faces were blank, their uniforms crisp, their hands folded neatly in their laps. But what truly froze the breath in Lena Mueller's chest wasn't the girls. It was the woman seated among them, older, rigid, dead center. Her stare pierced through the lens like it was meant to find someone. Her face was unsmiling, almost predatory. Who was she? Why was she never identified? And what had this photo been hiding for over 80 years? Lena Mueller wasn't looking for trouble. At 36, she had built a quiet, structured life as an archival specialist at the German Historical Museum in Berlin. She liked order, predictability. Most days were spent at her desk, surrounded by stacks of untouched documents, scanning, cataloging, and entering metadata into the museum's digital repository. She dealt in details, shelf codes, archival stamps, accession numbers. There were no surprises in Lena's world, which is why this photo, hidden where it never should have been, stood out immediately. It was a late afternoon in October. The museum's reading room was quiet, the kind of heavy silence that hangs over polished wood and old paper. Lena was processing a neglected box labeled Miscellaneous 1942. A nondescript title, nothing urgent. Most envelopes inside contained standard wartime material, ration cards, propaganda flyers, military forms. But one envelope, stuffed between two dull pamphlets, was different. It was older than the rest. Faded, smudged, no institutional labeling. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single photograph, sepia-toned, slightly curled at the corners. It showed a group of around 24 young girls, maybe aged 10 to 16, sitting and standing in neat rows. Their expressions were blank, and their uniforms were identical. Long wool skirts, stiff-collared blouses, boots polished to a shine. But Lena's eyes were drawn instantly to the woman in the middle of the front row. She looked to be in her 50s. Her posture was ramrod straight, hands clasped tightly in front of her, eyes fixed straight ahead. Lena turned the photo over. On the back, faint pencil marks had been mostly rubbed away. But a single line still remained, just visible if held against the light. Erased, but never forgotten. A seasoned archivist would normally begin with provenance, where the item came from, which collection it belonged to. But this photo had no paper trail. Lena Cross referenced it through the museum's internal database. No hits. Then she broadened her search to the National Archives, International War Records, and Holocaust photo registries. Still nothing. Not one image, report, or personnel log matched the woman's face. No mention of a facility with uniforms like the ones in the photo. No staff rosters, no school registries, no transport records. The girls were ghosts, and the woman might as well have never existed. This was nearly impossible. The Nazi regime was many things, but disorganized wasn't one of them. Their bureaucracy was obsessive. Every transport, every birth, every death, every role had a document, a stamp, a code. If this woman had worked for the Reich, especially in a youth facility, there should have been something. But Lena kept finding nothing. Slowly, she felt a weight building in her chest, A sickening sense that this photo had survived by accident, that it wasn't supposed to exist at all. Or worse, it was hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to see it. Was it a re-education school? A propaganda training facility? Something darker? The era, the year 1942, was peak wartime. In the East, extermination camps were operating at full scale. In Berlin, deportations had intensified. There were secret programs, some classified for decades, focused on psychological indoctrination, racial purification, and behavioral correction. But none were supposed to involve girls this young. And none of those operations listed someone like this woman. Lena's instincts as a historian, and something deeper, more primal, told her she had stumbled onto something dangerous. The photo wasn't just forgotten, it had been buried. And that begged the most terrifying question of all. What had this woman done that required her to be erased from memory completely? And why was someone still trying to keep it hidden? What happens when the dead stare back through history and refuse to disappear? Section 2. The Lost Facility. What was Oshula? It began with a blueprint no one was supposed to find, faded, mislabeled, and buried deep within a file folder marked Agricultural Reforms, 1942 to 1944. But what Lena Mueller discovered inside that folder would rewrite everything historians thought they knew about wartime Germany. A recent, groundbreaking revelation, so carefully hidden it had slipped past archivists, researchers, and international watchdogs for over 80 years. It wasn't just a plan for buildings. It was a map to something unspoken, something intentionally disguised. At the center of the document, a title in faint script, Oshula. Oshula. The name meant nothing at first. It didn't match any known Nazi facility, school, or administrative post. But the blueprint was detailed. Drawings of a secluded compound with symmetrical rows of dormitories, instructional halls, recreation areas, and at the bottom edge, a curious set of subterranean levels with no windows and no descriptions. One of the chambers bore a single word in small hand-inked letters, Camorra 3. A strange name. The number 3 suggested there were others, but only this one had been labeled. It was enough to set off alarms in Lena's mind. She traced the blueprint with care, identifying elements that matched standard architectural layouts used in elite National Socialist training schools, institutions like the Napolis, where promising youth were groomed for leadership and ideological obedience. But Oshula wasn't in any database. No surviving registry, no record of construction or funding, no survivors who had spoken about it publicly. It was an institution that had been erased, just like the woman in the photograph. Tucked behind the last page of the blueprint folder, Lena found an old personnel list, almost completely redacted. But one name escaped the censor's ink, faint but visible. Erika Krantz, SS Helfturmführerin, Special Instructor. The title, roughly translated to Senior Assistant Leader, was a genuine rank in women's SS auxiliary units. It gave her a connection, a role, a foothold in a mystery that until now had offered none. And yet, just like before, the name Erika Krantz produced no matches. Not in German war records, not in the Nuremberg Tribunal transcripts, not in survivor testimonies, nothing. That kind of silence was no coincidence. Lena widened her investigation. With the museum's restricted access archives and help from a retired forensic linguist, she decoded a string of annotations in the margins of the blueprint. The language was bureaucratic, sanitized. Phrases like behavioral standardization, repetition conditioning, and silent correction protocols. These were not academic terms. They hinted at practices that blurred the line between education and experimentation. Still, there was no mention of violence, no official indication of criminal behavior. But buried inside the folder was one more clue. A crumpled page from what appeared to be a diary. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. The entry read, "I dread Camorra 3. The lessons are silent and irreversible." What exactly happened inside that chamber? Lena knew she had to find the facility itself. With the help of a local historian named Pot Noak, she traced references in the blueprint to a remote village in northern Poland, once part of East Prussia. The site was now overgrown, crumbling, overtaken by time and trees, but its layout still matched the blueprint. The bones of Oshula were still there. Lena and Pot walked through collapsing door frames, past moss-covered walls and long-forgotten corridors. It was like walking through a scar history had tried to heal over. Then they found it. At the end of a narrow basement corridor, mostly buried beneath soil and debris, was a metal door. Rusted, half concealed by vines, its surface bore a small, hand-stamped number 3. Lena's pulse raced. This was Camorra 3. With effort, Pot pried it open. The hinges groaned. Inside, the air was thick with damp and age. Mold streaked the walls. The room was empty, bare floors, rotted paneling. But something behind one of the wooden boards caught Lena's eye. With cautious hands, they pulled it loose. Behind the paneling was a rusted tin box. Inside, sealed in wax paper, were 3 items: a brittle envelope containing undeveloped film, a stack of brittle paper slips, and a necklace. The pendant was small, iron, and engraved with a twisted knot symbol, identical to the one worn by the mysterious woman in Lena's photo. It was the first physical evidence connecting the photo to a real person. This was Erika Krantz. Back in Berlin, Lena developed the film in a private darkroom at the museum. What appeared on the negatives stopped her cold. Grainy, silent, and deeply unsettling. Young girls, some barely into adolescence, lined up in rows. Some were seated, others standing. In one image, a girl's hands were tied to the arms of her chair, her eyes wide and fixed downward. In another, a group of girls stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes closed, backs perfectly straight. What stood out wasn't just their fear. It was the uniformity, as if they had been trained not to move, not to react, and always in the background, watching, Erika Krantz. Sometimes standing, sometimes seated, always observing. In one image, she appeared to be taking notes. In another, she simply stared at the camera, calm, detached. These were not school photos. These were not classrooms. These were records, the kind no one was meant to see. But the horror didn't end with the film. On her second visit to the site in Poland, guided by elderly villagers who remembered rumors of girls taken away and never seen again, Lena ventured past the facility ruins toward the edge of the nearby forest. There, beneath a canopy of ancient oak trees, she found what she had feared: subtle depressions in the earth, rectangular, orderly, and silent. Lena contacted a Polish forensic team. Within weeks, the site was confirmed as a burial ground. Dozens of shallow graves were uncovered. The remains were consistent in age: adolescent girls, most between the ages of 10 and 16. Clothing fibers recovered from the soil matched the uniforms seen in the photograph. The physical traits of several skeletal remains matched the faces captured on Lena's film. Scientific verification was meticulous. Radiocarbon dating placed the burials around 1943. Soil stratigraphy, a method of dating based on layers of sediment, confirmed the graves were undisturbed since the war. Forensic anthropologists documented growth disruptions in several skeletons, suggesting prolonged psychological trauma or developmental stress. One forensic note read simply, "Signs of prolonged conditioning, behavioral restriction likely." Lena's photo was no longer a mystery. It was a window. Oshula wasn't a school. It was a site of psychological control, a facility where young girls were subjected to experiments not just on the body, but on the will. The final proof came with the pendant. An independent analysis of the symbol engraved on it matched an obscure insignia used briefly by a subdivision of the SS responsible for civil reform initiatives in Eastern territories. Though barely referenced in historical documents, Lena tracked a mention of the division in a British intelligence memo from 1946. It had been marked operationally disbanded and never followed up. And just like that, a story that was once considered lost, or never meant to be told, was now impossible to ignore. Lena had exposed not just a forgotten woman or a hidden photo, but an entire structure of organized silence. A facility that vanished from the historical record, a name erased from official documents, a crime covered not just by time, but by intention. Section 3. Why was Erica Krantz protected? Lena had finally connected the photograph to a name. She had unearthed the physical remains, the facility, the documents, and the film. Everything pointed to one person, Erica Krantz. And yet, for all the evidence she had gathered, something still didn't add up. There had been no criminal trial, no post-war denazification file, no mention of her in the lists of wanted war criminals or fugitives. Even the extensive Nuremberg documentation, thousands of pages detailing Nazi policies, chain of command, and staff lists, made no reference to Krantz or Oshula. How could someone so directly involved in such serious wrongdoing have simply disappeared from history? The answer came in a folder Lena almost missed, one buried within a batch of digitized, declassified files from the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps. These were released decades after the war under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, a piece of legislation passed in the United States to force intelligence agencies to open their records to public scrutiny. Most of the material was routine: personnel logs, interrogation transcripts, asset relocation files. But inside one document, her name appeared: Krantz, Erica, referred by Office of Strategic Services Berlin Station, to be held in reserve pending review for psychological operations capacity. Lena stared at the line in disbelief. It wasn't just that Erica Krantz had escaped justice, it was that she had been recruited. But why? The answer lay in a single phrase used across several memos: behavioral modification experience, female subjects, confined environment, sustained exposure. Krantz hadn't been seen as a war criminal. She had been viewed as a resource. Lena's research began shifting toward Cold War-era intelligence programs. One name appeared repeatedly: Operation Paperclip, a real-life initiative by the United States to bring Nazi scientists, engineers, and experts to work for the American military and intelligence community. Officially, Paperclip targeted rocket scientists and physicists, but unofficially, the program was broader than publicly acknowledged. Files declassified in the early 2000s revealed that some individuals brought under Paperclip or parallel programs had backgrounds in medicine, interrogation, and even propaganda. Then came the connection Lena hadn't expected to find: MKUltra. This was a secret CIA project launched in the 1950s to explore methods of mind control and psychological manipulation. The agency tested everything from harmful substance exposure to sensory isolation and behavioral conditioning. The goal was to find ways to control thought, influence loyalty, and alter memory. Some of the earliest notes in MKUltra documentation referenced foreign experimentation models and pre-existing European frameworks for coercive behavioral reform. Lena compared the MKUltra protocols with the files recovered from Oshula. The terminology was almost identical: compliance reinforcement, cognitive disruption, silent correction, emotional recalibration. These weren't coincidences. They were signals, linguistic fingerprints left behind by someone who had helped design both systems. Could Erica Krantz have been part of the foundation for Cold War psychological experimentation? Could the methods tested on children at Oshula have informed intelligence procedures later used by Western agencies? Lena presented these findings to her mentor, Dr. Friedrich Kohler, a retired professor who had quietly helped her piece together missing fragments. After reviewing her materials in silence, he spoke carefully. "Some people are too useful to punish," he said. It wasn't meant as justification. It was a diagnosis, a bitter truth. In the chaos that followed the end of the Second World War, lines had blurred. The Allied powers were not only dismantling fascism, they were also preparing for a new kind of war. And in that scramble, certain individuals were deemed more valuable for what they knew than accountable for what they had done. Kranz's area of expertise wasn't military strategy or nuclear physics, it was the human mind. She understood how to suppress identity, how to reshape behavior under pressure, how to train submission. Her facility wasn't a school, it was a test environment. The girls there weren't just victims, they were prototypes. Lena traced Kranz's trajectory through fragments of post-war movement reports. She had been moved between at least 3 occupied zones under different aliases. Her final known destination was a facility in Western Germany that, years later, was absorbed into a NATO-aligned psychological operations training center. There was no record of her after 1951. That was where the trail ended. It wasn't just that someone had deleted her history. It was that institutions had intentionally concealed it. Her name had been redacted, her image erased, her crimes denied. Not because no one knew, but because someone decided the cost of exposing her was higher than the benefit of justice. This wasn't just about one person. Lena realized she had uncovered a much larger pattern. During the Cold War, both Eastern and Western intelligence agencies competed for access to former Nazi expertise. Files were hidden, names changed, entire facilities reclassified as Special Operations Support. Kranz wasn't the only one, but she might have been one of the few whose legacy was traced all the way back to the source. As Lena compiled her findings into a report, she noticed something chilling. The more she wrote, the more files she consulted, the more frequently documents began disappearing. Some of her internal login credentials had been flagged. A note was placed in her personnel file, warning against unsanctioned research activity. When she returned to her apartment one evening, the door was slightly ajar. Nothing had been taken, but someone had clearly been inside. It was becoming clear. Someone didn't want this story to come out. After months of quiet warnings, revoked credentials, and the eerie feeling of being watched, Lena made her decision. She couldn't stay silent. Not anymore. With her access to the museum's archives blocked and her apartment clearly tampered with, Lena met with an investigative journalist from Der Spiegel at a quiet cafe in central Berlin. She brought everything: the pendant, the photographs, the film negatives, the diary page, and a dossier mapping every step of her research. It was thorough, detailed, and devastating. The response from Der Spiegel was immediate. A small team of reporters and fact-checkers began verifying Lena's discoveries, quietly and under tight security. They tracked down local witnesses in Poland, cross-checked forensic reports from the mass graves, and reached out to legal historians. Survivors began to step forward. One woman, now in her late 80s, described the facility in fragmented detail. The uniforms, the strange rules, the room with no windows where they were told to forget who they were. Her memories weren't perfectly clear, but her description matched the layout of Camorra 3 almost exactly. When the exposé finally dropped, it hit with force. Within hours, the story spread across global media platforms. Headlines ran with the images Lena had uncovered. Grainy stills of young girls standing in rigid silence, and behind them, the unmistakable face of Erika Kranz. The photograph, the same one Lena had found months earlier, was now on front pages around the world. A woman once erased from every official document was now the face of one of the most disturbing cover-ups in modern history. Section 4. Hidden in Plain Sight. The Real-World Cover-Ups. Why do some crimes vanish from the record, while others define generations? Why do certain names, faces, and locations stay hidden, protected even, while their victims are buried not just beneath soil, but beneath silence? Lena Mueller's discovery of Erika Krantz and the forgotten horrors of Oshula may seem like historical fiction, but the systems that allowed someone like Krantz to disappear are not imagined. They're real. And in recent years, disturbing evidence has emerged proving that many so-called forgotten atrocities weren't lost. They were hidden, on purpose, often by those in power. Take the island of Alderney, for example. One of the Channel Islands between England and France, Alderney was the only part of the British Isles to fall under Nazi control during the Second World War. For decades, the general understanding was that the occupation, while harsh, didn't involve the same scale of brutality seen in continental Europe. But in 2024, a new inquiry, quietly launched and fiercely debated, began uncovering something far darker. Recent findings suggest that Nazi forces operated forced labor and concentration camps on Alderney during their occupation from 1940 to 1945. Prisoners, including Jews, Eastern Europeans, and Soviet captives, were subjected to conditions that met the legal criteria for war crimes under the Geneva Conventions. These weren't small-scale operations. Thousands of prisoners were cycled through the island. Some historians estimate that hundreds, possibly more, never made it out. And yet, after the war, not a single Nazi officer stationed on Alderney was prosecuted. Why? According to newly reviewed UK government documents and expert testimony, there is growing suspicion that evidence was deliberately minimized or even suppressed after the liberation. British authorities may have feared embarrassment. The fact that Nazi camps operated on British soil was uncomfortable enough. But prosecuting those crimes could also have drawn attention to their own failures in prevention and oversight. So instead, a different approach was taken. Files were archived without proper classification. Witnesses were never formally interviewed. Deaths were attributed to illness or unexplained disappearance. The truth was buried under paperwork, delays, and decades of inaction. This isn't speculation. In 2024, Britain's Ministry of Defense confirmed that it had reopened investigations into Alderney's wartime role. The Alderney Expert Review Panel, an independent body, was established to determine not just what happened, but why so little was done after the war. Their findings are due soon, and early leaks suggest the possibility of deliberate obfuscation at multiple levels of government. This isn't just history catching up, it's history finally being allowed to speak. But this isn't the only story to emerge. Another shock came from the Vatican, an institution long criticized for its perceived silence during the Holocaust. For years, defenders of Pope Pius XII claimed he didn't know the full extent of the atrocities or that he chose silence to protect Catholics under Nazi control. But new evidence tells a different story. In 2023, historians examining Vatican archives, finally opened to researchers after decades of pressure, discovered letters dated December 1942. These were not vague reports. They came directly from a German Jesuit priest who had access to insider knowledge through his contacts in Nazi-occupied Poland. The priest detailed mass killings at specific locations, referencing 6,000 persons daily, especially Poles and Jews being suffocated with gas. The report was not only clear but chillingly specific. And it was sent directly to Pope Pius XII's office. So why didn't the Vatican respond publicly? Why wasn't there a condemnation? According to scholars now analyzing internal memos from the same period, church officials feared that taking a stand would trigger retaliation, not only against Catholics in Europe, but against the institutional church itself. It was a calculation. Speak out and risk backlash, or remain silent and protect the broader organization. For many, this revelation wasn't surprising. But what makes it extraordinary is how carefully the documentation had been withheld. For decades, researchers were told there was no smoking gun. Now it's clear there was, and it had been locked away in a drawer labeled classified. The excuse of ignorance no longer holds. What remains is the question of complicity. The pattern continues when we shift focus to the United States and its handling of former Nazis in the years following the war. Operation Paperclip, now widely acknowledged, involved the recruitment of over 1,200 Nazi scientists, engineers, and technicians, many of whom had direct ties to the regime's weapons programs, including the V-2 rocket and chemical weapons development. Wernher von Braun, one of the most famous examples, later became a key figure in NASA's Apollo program. Publicly, Operation Paperclip was framed as a race against the Soviet Union. The idea was that if the Americans didn't bring these experts over, the Russians would. But what the public wasn't told was that many of these individuals were suspected war criminals. In some cases, documentation of their past activities was rewritten, scrubbed, or outright destroyed to allow them entry into the U.S. under new identities. This wasn't an accident. Memos released under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act show that U.S. intelligence agencies actively debated whether certain recruits were too controversial. The decision, time and time again, came down to this: if the knowledge was valuable, the past was considered negotiable. This same rationale likely shielded individuals like Erika Krantz in Lena's fictional investigation, and it's not far removed from reality. One particularly troubling comparison comes from Japan. While Germany's war crimes have been extensively documented and prosecuted, Japan's crimes, especially those involving human experimentation, remained largely unpunished. Unit 731, a secret military research facility based in Manchuria, conducted experiments on living subjects, including Chinese civilians and Allied prisoners of war. The experiments were disguised as medical research, but often involved exposure to biological weapons, forced starvation, and surgical procedures without anesthesia. After the war, instead of facing prosecution, many of Unit 731's scientists were granted immunity by the U.S. in exchange for their data. American military intelligence officers saw the information gathered through these experiments as useful, particularly for Cold War bioweapons research. The unit's leader, General Shiro Ishii, lived freely after the war and was never brought to trial. This is not a theory. Declassified U.S. documents from the late 1940s confirm that the decision to shield Unit 731 scientists was made at the highest levels. The data was considered unobtainable through conventional means, and therefore too valuable to ignore. These files were marked with the same terminology used in Operation Paperclip: operational necessity, intelligence priority, and subject to confidential transfer. The idea that knowledge, especially knowledge gained through unethical means, can override justice is not new. But what makes these cases so disturbing is how widespread, coordinated, and deliberate the cover-ups were. These weren't isolated decisions made in moments of chaos. They were strategic choices made by stable governments and powerful institutions, all deciding that some truths were better left hidden. Lena Mueller's discovery of Erika Krantz is fiction, but the world that allowed someone like Krantz to disappear is all too real. Whether it's an island off the coast of Britain, a hidden file in the Vatican, a sealed U.S. archive, or a forgotten bunker in Manchuria, the pattern is consistent. Crimes concealed, records sanitized, accountability delayed or denied altogether. And the question that rises from all of this is not whether it happened, but how often it happened without us even knowing. How many names like Erika Krantz were quietly removed from databases, not because they were unimportant, but because they were too important to prosecute? How many crimes were classified not as atrocities, but as research assets? And how many survivors have lived entire lives knowing what happened to them was never officially acknowledged? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Click the next video for more exciting content.